In 1981, the world started looking at itself through screens, not as a metaphor, but as something literal, concrete, and everyday. Offices were receiving machines that nobody quite knew how to use. Television channels were broadcasting images that had previously only existed inside recording studios. Royal weddings were being transmitted into millions of homes simultaneously. And news, even the most unsettling kind, was arriving at speeds that still caught people off guard. It was a year when the future seemed to be closing in too fast, and nobody was entirely sure whether that was a good sign or a warning. In August of that year, IBM introduced its personal computer. The name was straightforward: the IBM Personal Computer, or simply the IBM PC. It was not the first home computer ever made, but it was the one that changed the rules of the market in a way none of its predecessors had managed. IBM was the tech giant of the era, a company associated with suits and boardrooms, with governments and large corporations. The fact that IBM was betting on a machine for individual use sent an unmistakable signal. Personal computing was no longer a hobby for engineers and enthusiasts. It was becoming something serious, something that businesses and eventually households were going to need. The operating system running on that machine had been developed by a relatively small company called Microsoft. At the time, that felt like a minor technical detail. It would turn out to be one of the most consequential business decisions in modern history. Within a few years, the architecture of the IBM PC would become the global industry standard, and the name Microsoft would become inseparable from personal computing itself. While the IBM PC was making its way into offices, another technological milestone was unfolding in space. In April of 1981, the space shuttle Columbia launched for the very first time. It was a reusable spacecraft, something that had never existed before in the history of space exploration. Previous rockets were used once and then discarded into the ocean. The Columbia could return, land on a runway, and fly again. Two astronauts, John Young and Robert Crippen, carried out that first mission. The flight lasted just over 2 days, but what it represented was far larger. The idea that space travel could become something more routine, more accessible, almost industrial. It was the era's technological confidence at its most visible. Two very different projects, in two very different fields, were both signaling that much of the world was placing serious bets on a future built on science and systems. That confidence also had a soundtrack, and in 1981, that soundtrack started to have a face. On the 1st of August, MTV went on the air in the United States for the first time. The channel launched with a statement of intent that could hardly have been more on the nose. The first video it broadcast was "Video Killed the Radio Star" by the British group The Buggles. It was almost too obvious, but it was also completely honest. MTV was not trying to hide what it was, a declaration that image had become an essential part of popular music. Up until that point, a song was something you listened to. After MTV, it was also something you watched. Artists who understood that shift found themselves with an enormous platform. Those who did not began to fall behind. The relationship between music, fashion, the body, performance, and the market changed in ways that are still felt today. The music video was no longer a complement to a song. In many cases, it was becoming the more visible face of the two. That same year, global pop culture produced one of the most watched moments of the decade. On July 29th, Prince Charles of England married Lady Diana Spencer at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The ceremony was broadcast live to more than 700 million people around the world. That number is difficult to fully grasp. 700 million people watching the same image at the same moment, from different continents and time zones. Diana was 20 years old. The dress, the procession, the music, the crowds lining the streets of London, the commentators speaking in different languages. All of it was covered with an intensity that anticipated the kind of media saturation that would become standard in the decades ahead. The wedding was not just a wedding, it was a global spectacle, one of the first of its kind, and the world received it with that particular mix of fascination and collective emotion that only live events can generate. But 1981 was not all spectacle and celebration. In May, Pope John Paul II was shot in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. The gunman was a Turkish citizen named Mehmet Ali Aka. The bullet struck the Pope in the abdomen, and for hours the world followed the medical updates with a kind of tension that had rarely been felt around a religious figure. John Paul II survived. Months later, he would visit his attacker in prison, in one of the most widely discussed gestures of his entire papacy. The attempt on the life of one of the most influential religious leaders on the planet sent a shockwave across borders, faiths, and cultures. For many people, it was the first time a news event of that scale reached their homes almost as it was happening. 2 months earlier, in March, something similar had unfolded in Washington. Ronald Reagan, who had taken office as President of the United States just that January, was shot outside the Washington Hilton Hotel. He was 70 years old and had been in office for only 69 days. The attack was carried out by a young man named John Hinckley, Jr., who had a documented history of psychiatric problems. A bullet lodged near his heart came close to killing him. Reagan survived, and his recovery was covered by the media with a combination of relief and admiration. Politically, the assassination attempt reinforced his public image at a moment when he was still establishing his authority with Congress and with international allies. The image of the wounded president walking toward the hospital before collapsing was burned into the collective memory of an entire generation. That same year, in June, the Centers for Disease Control in the United States published a brief but deeply troubling report. It described 5 cases of an unusual form of pneumonia identified in young men in Los Angeles. The disease was attacking the immune system in a way doctors had never seen before, leaving the body defenseless against infections that would normally pose no serious threat. No one yet knew what was causing it, how it was being transmitted, or how far it could spread. At the time, the report went almost unnoticed outside specialized medical circles. But those 5 clinical cases were the first formal documentation of what would later be known as AIDS. The years that followed would make it devastatingly clear that this June 1981 document marked the beginning of one of the worst public health crises of the 20th century. At the time, nobody knew that yet. While all of this was unfolding, the Cold War continued to provide the underlying tension that shaped global politics. In Poland, the labor movement known as Solidarity, led by an electrician named Lech Wałęsa, had gathered millions of members and was applying growing pressure on the communist government. It was something without precedent inside the Soviet bloc, an organized workers' movement openly challenging the regime without being immediately crushed. Moscow was watching with increasing discomfort. In December of 1981, General Wojciech Jaruzelski declared martial law in Poland, suspended Solidarity's activities, and had its leaders arrested. The experiment in organized resistance was shut down by force, but the roots were already in the ground. Solidarity was not going away, and what it had demonstrated that year was that the Soviet bloc could be challenged from within. Reagan had come to the presidency with a clearly defined anti-communist agenda, and his administration ramped up military spending with the goal of putting economic pressure on the Soviet Union. The reasoning was that if the Soviets had to keep pace in an arms race over the long term, their resources would eventually give out. It was an expensive long-range gamble, and in 1981 there was no way to know whether it would work. What was already clear was that the world lived with the constant awareness that two superpowers armed with nuclear warheads were defining the boundaries of what was possible for everyone else. That was the backdrop against which 1981 played out. Screens lit up across the globe, images traveling at unprecedented speeds, technologies promising to reshape everyday life, and at the same time, open wounds, a disease without a name, bullets that nearly altered the course of world politics. Computers were arriving in offices, music was learning to be visual. A royal wedding gathered 700 million witnesses. And beneath all of that movement, the world remained a place where leaders could be shot on the street, where an unknown disease could be spreading in silence, and where the balance between two armed blocs depended on decisions most people would never know about. The 80s were not just getting started. They already had their own shape, their own temperature, their own weight. And 1981 was the year that became impossible to deny.